On October 15, 2023, veteran fisherman Ezra Thornfield expected to find lobsters in trap number 47. Instead, he pulled up a secret that powerful people had been hiding for 36 years. The morning started like any other for Ezra. He'd been working these waters off the Maine coast for 37 years, and Blackwater Bay held no surprises for him anymore. The fog hung thick that Tuesday morning, but Ezra knew every current, every rock formation, every safe passage through the treacherous area locals called Devil's Teeth. Ezra had set his traps near the granite outcropping 3 days earlier. The water here ran deep and cold, perfect for lobsters, but dangerous for inexperienced fishermen. Ships had been going down in these waters for centuries, and the strong currents could drag anything down into the darkness and keep it there forever. But when Ezra hauled up trap 47, something was terribly wrong. The trap felt heavier than it should, much heavier. His weathered hands worked the winch, bringing the metal cage up through the dark water. When it finally broke the surface, Ezra's blood turned to ice. Tangled in the metal bars, wrapped around the bait bag like some horrible decoration, was a human skull. Ezra had seen plenty in his decades on the water: storm victims, accident casualties, even suicide cases. But this was different. Even through the algae and barnacles covering the bone, he could see something that made his stomach turn. A crack ran from the left temple down to the base of the skull, and there was something metallic embedded near the fracture. This wasn't an accident victim. Someone had been murdered. Ezra's hands shook as he radioed the Coast Guard. Within an hour, his fishing boat was surrounded by law enforcement vessels. Detective Marlo Chen from the Maine State Police was the first to board his boat, and when she saw what was in that trap, her face went white. "How long has this trap been down?" Chen asked. 3 days, Ezra replied, his voice barely steady. "But I've been fishing these waters my whole life. I've never seen anything like this." Chen carefully photographed the skull from every angle before having it removed by the medical examiner. But even as the bone evidence was taken away, questions multiplied like storm clouds on the horizon. The skull showed signs of long-term submersion, but the barnacle growth patterns were unusual. Marine biologists would later determine that the remains hadn't been in one location continuously. Someone had been moving this skull, managing it, keeping it hidden. But why? And who? The local news picked up the story within hours. Human remains found in lobster trap off Maine coast. But they had no idea they were reporting on a discovery that would expose a conspiracy reaching into the highest levels of government. Ezra couldn't shake the feeling that he'd been sailing over this skull for years, maybe decades, never knowing that evidence of murder lay just beneath his boat. The thought haunted him. How many times had he anchored near this spot? How many peaceful mornings had he spent fishing directly above someone's final resting place? The Coast Guard established a search perimeter around Devil's Teeth, but they found nothing else. Just that single skull with its telltale crack and mysterious metal fragment. Detective Chen ordered the skull to be sent to the state forensics lab for analysis, but she already suspected this case would become much bigger than a simple homicide. The location, the condition of the remains, the careful way they'd been managed, everything pointed to a murder that had been planned and covered up with professional precision. Before diving deeper into this investigation, don't forget to subscribe to 24 Hours True Crime and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what comes next, because what Detective Chen was about to discover would connect this skull to a missing scientist, a Nazi submarine, and a criminal conspiracy that had been operating in plain sight for over 70 years. The DNA results came back faster than anyone expected. The skull belonged to Dr. Helena Vasquez, a 34-year-old marine biologist who had vanished without a trace on September 23, 1987. Her disappearance had baffled investigators for 36 years, and now Detective Chen understood why the case had never been solved. Helena hadn't simply vanished. She'd been murdered, and her killer had been managing her remains ever since. Helena Vasquez had been brilliant, Born in San Diego to immigrant parents who worked double shifts to pay for her education, she'd earned her PhD in marine biology from Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution before joining the prestigious Darrington Institute in Maine. At 34, she was already considered one of the leading experts in deep-water sonar analysis. But Helena was more than just smart. She was obsessively careful about her work and meticulous about her personal life. She called her mother in California every Sunday at exactly 7 p.m. She never missed a deadline. She kept detailed logs of everything, her research, her meals, even her daily exercise routine. That's what made her disappearance so disturbing. On September 23, 1987, Helena had taken her research vessel out to conduct what she called routine sonar mapping in the deep waters near Blackwater Bay. She was supposed to return by sunset. When she didn't come back, her colleagues assumed she'd encountered equipment problems or rough weather. But Helena's boat was found the next morning, drifting empty about 2 miles from Devil's Teeth. The engine was still running. Her research equipment was undisturbed. Her coffee was still warm in the cup. Helena Vasquez had simply vanished. The original investigation, led by Detective Raymond Krause, had all the elements of a perfect mystery. A brilliant scientist, working on classified research, disappears without explanation. No body, no witnesses, no clear motive for foul play. Detective Krause had interviewed everyone at the Darrington Institute. Helena's mentor, Professor Dominic Clearwater, described her as dedicated but increasingly stressed about her work. Victoria Greystone, the Institute's administrative director, said Helena had been working longer hours and seemed worried about something she wouldn't discuss. Marcus Finley, Helena's research assistant, told investigators that Helena had become paranoid in her final weeks. She'd started checking her car for tracking devices. She'd asked him strange questions about who had access to her research files. She'd even mentioned that she felt like someone was following her. She said she'd discovered something that certain people didn't want exposed, Finley had told Detective Krause. But when I asked what she meant, she just said it was better if I didn't know. The investigation had considered every possibility. Maybe Helena had suffered a mental breakdown and committed suicide. Maybe she'd staged her own disappearance to escape some unknown pressure. Maybe she'd been having an affair and had run away with a lover. But the people who knew Helena best never believed those theories. Her mother, Rosa Vasquez, had flown to Maine and spent weeks searching the coastline herself. She'd told investigators that Helena would never abandon her family, never leave without explanation. "My daughter called every Sunday for 15 years, Rosa had said through tears. She missed one call when she had the flu, and she apologized for a week. Helena didn't just disappear. Something happened to her. The case had consumed Detective Krause for months. He'd followed every lead, interviewed every contact, analyzed every piece of evidence. But without a body or clear proof of a crime, the investigation eventually went cold. Helena Vasquez became just another missing person file in a cabinet full of unsolved cases. Over the years, there had been occasional developments, reported sightings in other states, tips from psychics, theories from amateur detectives, but nothing substantial ever emerged. Helena Vasquez had vanished as completely as if she'd never existed. Now, 36 years later, Detective Chen was looking at that cold case file with new understanding. Helena hadn't disappeared voluntarily, and she hadn't committed suicide. She'd been murdered by someone who knew her, someone who had planned the killing carefully and managed the cover-up for decades. But why? What had Helena discovered that was worth killing for? Chen began digging deeper into Helena's research files, and what she found there would change everything. Hidden in the archives of the Darrington Institute, sealed away in files marked Classified Defense Contract, was the key to understanding why a brilliant young scientist had to die. Helena's research wasn't just about marine biology. She'd been hired by the Department of Defense to investigate unusual sonar readings in the deep waters off Maine. Readings that suggested something large and artificial was resting on the ocean floor, something that wasn't supposed to be there. Helena's final research notes, dated just 3 days before her disappearance, contained a discovery that would have shocked the world. She'd found what appeared to be a German U-boat from World War II, sitting intact in 300 feet of water. But this wasn't just any submarine. According to Helena's notes, the vessel showed signs of recent activity. Someone had been visiting this underwater wreck regularly, removing items from the cargo hold. The submarine that was supposed to have been sunk in 1944 was still being used in 1987. Helena had discovered something that powerful people had spent decades keeping secret. And when she'd threatened to expose the truth, they'd made sure she could never tell anyone. The question was, who were they, and were they still protecting their secret today? Detective Chen spent 3 sleepless nights reading through Helena's classified research files, and by the end, she understood why someone had been willing to commit murder to keep these secrets buried. Getting access to those files had been a battle in itself. The Darrington Institute's current director, Dr. James Morrison, had initially claimed that Helena's research records were either lost or destroyed. When Chen pressed harder, citing the ongoing murder investigation, Morrison suddenly discovered that some files might exist in a restricted archive. Those files told a story that no one was supposed to read. Helena's official assignment had been straightforward enough: investigate unusual sonar contacts detected by Navy submarines during routine patrols off the Maine coast. The readings showed a large metallic object resting on the seafloor in nearly 300 feet of water. The Navy wanted to know what it was, but Helena's investigation had uncovered something far more explosive than anyone expected. The object was a German U-boat, specifically the U-219, which according to official records had been sunk in the North Atlantic in April 1944. Yet here it was, sitting intact on the bottom of the Atlantic, just 20 miles from the Maine coast. Helena's sonar scans revealed that the submarine's hull was remarkably well preserved. More disturbing, her underwater camera equipment had captured images showing that the vessel's cargo hatches had been opened recently. Fresh tool marks were visible on the metal, and there were signs that someone had been systematically removing items from the submarine's interior. The U-219 wasn't just a war relic, it was still being actively looted. Helena's research notes became increasingly urgent as she dug deeper into the mystery. She'd contacted naval historians, trying to understand how a submarine reported sunk near Iceland had ended up off the American coast. What she learned had terrified her. The U-219 had been on a special mission when it was supposedly destroyed. Unlike typical combat submarines, it had been modified to carry cargo rather than additional torpedoes. German records suggested it had been transporting high-ranking Nazi officials and valuable materials to South America as the war neared its end. But the submarine had never reached South America. Instead, it had apparently made it to the American coast, where it had either been sunk or deliberately scuttled. And for over 40 years, someone had been quietly accessing its cargo. Helena's final research entries revealed the scope of what she'd discovered. Using advanced imaging equipment, she'd mapped the submarine's interior and documented evidence of systematic looting. Cargo containers had been emptied. Personal belongings had been removed. Most importantly, what appeared to be document containers had been opened and their contents extracted. But Helena had found something the looters had missed. Hidden in a sealed compartment near the submarine's stern, her remote cameras had detected what looked like metal cases still intact after 4 decades underwater. Helena believed these cases contained documents or materials that could reveal the identities of the people who'd been accessing the wreck. Her plan had been simple: organize a legitimate archaeological expedition to recover the remaining artifacts and expose whoever had been looting the site. She'd already begun drafting a report that would have made international headlines. That report was never finished. Chen discovered that Helena had been preparing to contact federal authorities about her findings when she disappeared. Draft letters to the FBI and Coast Guard were found on her computer, along with detailed photographs and sonar scans that would have provided irrefutable evidence of the ongoing looting operation. Someone had known about Helena's plans and had acted to stop her. But who? And how had they learned what Helena was planning? Chen began looking more carefully at the people who'd had access to Helena's research. The Darrington Institute operated under multiple government contracts, and several employees had security clearances that gave them access to classified projects. Someone on the inside had been monitoring Helena's work and reporting to the people who were looting the U-219. The more Chen studied the timeline, the more obvious it became that Helena's murder had been carefully planned. Her killer hadn't acted impulsively. They'd known exactly when Helena would be alone on her research vessel, and they'd had a plan for disposing of her body that would prevent discovery for decades. Chen also realized that the murder hadn't ended the threat to the looting operation. Helena's research files contained enough evidence to expose the entire scheme. Yet those files had remained sealed and classified for 36 years. Someone with significant influence had made sure Helena's discoveries never saw the light of day. The conspiracy reached far beyond a simple murder case. This was about systematic theft of historical artifacts, obstruction of justice, and the corruption of scientific research for personal gain. The people involved had operated with impunity for nearly 8 decades, confident that their secret would remain buried on the ocean floor. But Helena's skull surfacing in Ezra Thornfield's lobster trap had changed everything. The conspiracy was about to be exposed, and the people who'd killed to protect their secret were about to face justice. The question was, how many of them were still alive and how far would they go to protect themselves? Detective Chen knew that Helena's killer was someone close to her, someone who'd gained her trust before betraying her. As she dug deeper into the lives of Helena's colleagues from 1987, a disturbing pattern emerged. Everyone around Helena had been hiding something. Professor Dominic Clearwater had been Helena's mentor and the nominal head of the submarine research project. In 1987, he'd been 58 years old, a respected oceanographer with an impeccable reputation and connections throughout the academic world. He'd told investigators that Helena was brilliant, but had been under tremendous pressure in her final weeks. But Chen discovered that Clearwater's background wasn't as clean as it appeared. Hidden in his personnel files was information that the 1987 investigation had missed. Clearwater hadn't just been an academic during World War II. He'd served in naval intelligence, specifically in a unit tasked with tracking down Nazi assets and personnel who'd fled Europe as the war ended. He would have known exactly what the U-219 represented and why its cargo was valuable. More troubling, financial records showed that Clearwater had made several large purchases in the months following Helena's disappearance. A new house, expensive research equipment, and investments that seemed well beyond his professor's salary. When questioned in 1987, he'd claimed the money came from consulting fees and family inheritance. But Chen couldn't find any evidence to support those claims. Victoria Greystone presented a different kind of problem. As the Darrington Institute's administrative director, she'd controlled access to research facilities and had intimate knowledge of every project conducted there. She'd been the one to report Helena missing and had provided investigators with their timeline of events. Greystone's story had been consistent throughout the original investigation. Helena had seemed worried and distracted in her final weeks, but hadn't confided in anyone about specific concerns. Greystone had emphasized Helena's dedication to her work and her excitement about the submarine discovery. But Chen found troubling inconsistencies when she compared Greystone's statements to other evidence. Greystone had claimed that Helena worked alone on the submarine project, yet equipment logs showed that several other researchers had accessed the same materials Helena was using. Greystone had also stated that Helena's research was purely academic, despite the clear Defense Department classification on the files. Now 89 and living in a Portland nursing home, Greystone's memory was failing, but Chen noticed that her recollections of certain events remained remarkably sharp. She could describe Helena's research in detail, could remember specific dates and conversations, yet claimed to have no knowledge of the submarine's true significance. Marcus Finley had been Helena's research assistant, the person closest to her work and most likely to know what she'd discovered. His account of Helena's final weeks had shaped the entire original investigation. He described a brilliant scientist becoming increasingly paranoid and isolated, convinced that someone was following her. But when Chen tracked down Finley, now a successful maritime salvage operator based in Portland, his story began to shift in subtle but significant ways. During their first interview, Finley maintained his original account. Helena had been stressed, worried about something she wouldn't discuss, increasingly suspicious of the people around her. He'd assumed her concerns were related to the pressure of working on a classified project. But under closer questioning, Finley revealed details he'd never mentioned to the original investigators. Helena had asked him about the Institute's security procedures. She'd wanted to know who had access to her research files and how they were protected. She'd even asked him to help her make copies of certain documents, just in case something happened. Finley claimed he'd thought Helena was being overly cautious, but Chen suspected he'd known more about Helena's concerns than he'd admitted. His current business, maritime salvage and underwater recovery, gave him exactly the skills and equipment needed to access a sunken submarine. The most intriguing figure was Judge Theodore Blackmore, who'd been a federal prosecutor in 1987. His name appeared only peripherally in the original investigation files, but his influence seemed to reach into every aspect of the case. Blackmore had been the prosecutor who'd reviewed the Helena Vasquez case when it was first reported. He determined that there wasn't sufficient evidence to treat it as a federal crime, leaving the investigation to local authorities. He'd also been involved in reviewing the classification status of Helena's research, ensuring that her findings remained sealed. Chen discovered that Blackmore had connections to all the other players. He'd served on the board of the Darrington Institute. He'd been Clearwater's personal attorney for several legal matters. He'd even handled some financial transactions for Victoria Greystone. Now a sitting federal judge with enormous influence, Blackmore had the power to make investigations disappear entirely. His career had flourished since 1987, rising from prosecutor to state judge to his current federal position. He'd accumulated wealth that seemed disproportionate to his government salary, owning properties throughout New England, and maintaining a lifestyle that suggested income sources beyond his judicial pay. But the most disturbing discovery came when Chen began mapping the relationships between all four suspects. They weren't just colleagues or professional associates. They were part of something larger, something that had connected them long before Helena's murder. Financial records revealed a web of shell companies, offshore accounts, and investment partnerships that linked all four individuals. Money had been flowing between these accounts for decades, suggesting an ongoing criminal enterprise rather than a single murder committed to cover up a discovery. Helena hadn't just stumbled onto evidence of historical looting. She'd discovered a conspiracy that was still active, still profitable, and still being protected by people in positions of power. The network that had killed Helena Vasquez wasn't just covering up the past. They were actively profiting from it, and they'd been doing so for nearly half a century. The forensic analysis of Helena's skull revealed details that made Detective Chen's blood run cold. This hadn't been a crime of passion or a tragic accident. Helena Vasquez had been executed with professional precision. Dr. Sarah Kim, the state's chief medical examiner, called Chen to her lab on a gray November morning. What she had to show would transform the investigation from a cold case into an active conspiracy. "The crack you saw in the skull isn't from blunt force trauma," Dr. Kim explained, pointing to the distinctive fracture line. "It's an exit wound. Helena was shot in the head with a small caliber weapon, fired from very close range." The metal fragment embedded in the bone told the rest of the story. Ballistics analysis confirmed it was a piece of a .22 caliber bullet, the kind of weapon professionals often preferred because it was effective at close range but difficult to trace. The bullet had been fired from behind Helena's left ear, execution style. But the most disturbing revelation came from the marine forensics analysis. Dr. Kim had brought in specialists to examine the barnacle growth and mineral deposits on Helena's skull. What they found defied every assumption about the case timeline. These remains weren't in the water continuously since 1987, Dr. Kim explained. The growth patterns show periods of submersion followed by periods of dry storage. Someone has been moving this skull regularly for 36 years. The implications were staggering. Helena's killer hadn't just murdered her and dumped her body. They'd been actively managing her remains, moving them whenever there was risk of discovery. This wasn't a decades-old crime. It was an ongoing conspiracy. The forensic team had identified at least 4 distinct periods when Helena's skull had been removed from the water. The most recent movement had occurred sometime in the past 6 months, just before Ezra Thornfield made his discovery. Chen realized that Helena's killer was still alive, still active, and still covering their tracks. The discovery of the skull hadn't been an accident of time and tide. It had been the result of someone panicking and making a mistake. But why had they moved the skull so recently? What had triggered their fear that it might be discovered? The answer came when Chen cross-referenced the timeline with recent events at the Darrington Institute. 6 months earlier, the Institute had announced plans for a major expansion of their deep-water research program. New sonar mapping of the seafloor around Blackwater Bay was scheduled to begin in the spring of 2024. Someone had realized that advanced sonar equipment might detect Helena's remains where they'd been hidden for decades. Rather than risk discovery, they'd moved the skull to what they thought was a safer location near Devil's Teeth. They'd miscalculated. The strong currents in that area had carried the skull directly into Ezra's lobster trap. Dr. Kim's team had also found trace evidence on the skull that provided crucial clues about where it had been stored during the dry periods. Microscopic analysis revealed concrete dust, machine oil, and paint chips that suggested Helena's remains had been kept in some kind of industrial facility. The paint chips were particularly significant. Chemical analysis showed they contained lead compounds that hadn't been used in commercial paint since the 1970s. This meant Helena's remains had been stored in an older building, possibly one connected to maritime operations. Chen began searching for facilities that matched this profile. The Maine coast was dotted with old shipyards, abandoned warehouses, and decommissioned military installations that could have served as hiding places. But the forensic evidence revealed something even more chilling. DNA analysis of material found with the skull showed traces of multiple people who had handled Helena's remains over the years. This wasn't the work of a single killer acting alone. It was evidence of an organized group that had been protecting their secret for decades. The conspiracy was larger than Chen had imagined, and it was still very much alive. Helena's killers weren't just covering up a 36-year-old murder. They were actively working to prevent its discovery, using resources and coordination that suggested significant organization and funding. Chen knew she was now hunting people who had successfully hidden a murder for over 3 decades, people with the means and motivation to kill again. Helena's skull surfacing had been their first major mistake in 36 years. The question was, would it be their last? The call came at 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday in late November. Detective Chen was jolted awake by her phone, and the voice on the other end changed everything she thought she knew about Helena's murder. "Detective Chen, this is Marcus Finley. We need to talk, tonight, and you need to come alone." Finley's voice was strained, frightened. This wasn't the confident maritime salvage operator Chen had interviewed weeks earlier. This was a man on the edge of breaking. "I can't do this anymore," Finley continued. "I've been carrying this secret for 36 years, and it's killing me. Literally. I'm dying, detective, and I need to tell someone the truth before it's too late." Chen agreed to meet Finley at an all-night diner in Bar Harbor, far from Portland, and the prying eyes of anyone who might be watching either of them. She drove through the pre-dawn darkness, wondering what Finley was about to reveal, but nothing could have prepared her for his confession. Finley was already seated in a back booth when Chen arrived, nervously stirring coffee that had long since gone cold. He looked like he'd aged 10 years since their last meeting. His face was gaunt, his hands shaking, and there was a desperate quality in his eyes that Chen had seen in people who knew their time was running out. "I have pancreatic cancer," Finley said without preamble. "Stage 4. The doctors give me maybe 3 months. I've spent 36 years living with what I know, and I can't take it to my grave. Chen sat across from him, her recorder already running. What do you need to tell me, Marcus? Finley took a shuddering breath. I was there the night Helena died. I saw them kill her. The words hung in the air like smoke. Chen felt her heart racing, but she kept her voice steady. Tell me what happened. Finley's story came out in broken pieces, decades of guilt and fear finally finding voice. He'd been more than just Helena's research assistant. He'd been feeding information about her work to people who were paying him to monitor the submarine project. It started small, Finley explained. Just reports on what Helena was finding, how her research was progressing. They told me it was routine, that the government needed to know about any discoveries that might have national security implications. But as Helena got closer to understanding the true significance of the U-219, Finley's handlers had become more demanding. They wanted copies of her research files, details about her plans, access to her equipment and findings. I thought I was helping protect national security, Finley said, his voice breaking. I had no idea I was helping them plan her murder. The confrontation had happened on Helena's research vessel, anchored near Devil's Teeth, on the night of September 23, 1987. Finley had been instructed to get Helena out to the site under the pretense of conducting additional sonar scans. She trusted me, Finley whispered. She had no idea I'd betrayed her. 3 men had been waiting on a smaller boat hidden among the rocks near Devil's Teeth. When they boarded Helena's vessel, Finley had hidden below deck, listening in terror as the situation escalated. The men had demanded that Helena turn over all her research and agree to remain silent about the submarine. They'd offered her money, threatened her career, and finally resorted to physical intimidation, but Helena had refused to back down. She told them she wouldn't be part of covering up what was obviously a criminal operation, Finley recalled. She said the American people deserved to know what had been stolen from that submarine and who had been profiting from it. That's when Professor Clearwater had appeared from the shadows of the boat's cabin. Helena's face when she saw him, Finley said, tears streaming down his cheeks. The betrayal in her eyes. Her own mentor, the man who'd taught her everything about marine archaeology, was part of the conspiracy. Clearwater had tried one last time to convince Helena to stay quiet. He'd explained that the submarine's cargo had been financing important research for decades, that exposing the operation would harm legitimate scientific work. Helena had listened to his arguments and then delivered her final answer. She looked him right in the eye and said, "Dominic, you're asking me to be an accessory to theft and conspiracy. I won't do it." Clearwater had pulled out a small pistol and shot Helena in the head without another word. It happened so fast, Finley sobbed. 1 second she was standing there, defiant and brave, and the next she was gone. They'd planned it all along. They never intended to let her leave that boat alive. But Finley's revelation came with its own terrible twist. He hadn't just been a terrified witness to murder. He'd been a willing participant in the cover-up that followed. The conspirators had made him an offer he couldn't refuse, help them dispose of Helena's body and manage the evidence, or join her at the bottom of the ocean. Finley had chosen to live, becoming an active part of the conspiracy that had protected Helena's killers for 36 years. "They've been paying me ever since," Finley admitted. "My salvage business, my house, my entire life, it's all built on blood money. And I've been helping them move Helena's remains whenever they thought discovery was possible." Finley reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick envelope. "Everything's in here. Names, bank accounts, meeting locations, evidence storage sites. It's all the proof you'll need to bring them down." Chen took the envelope with hands that weren't quite steady. "Why now, Marcus? Why are you telling me this after all these years?" Finley looked out the diner window at the approaching dawn. "Because I'm dying, and they know it. They've already started making plans to silence me permanently. This cancer is going to kill me, but I'll be damned if I let them do it first." As Finley prepared to leave, he delivered one final warning that made Chen's blood freeze. "Detective, they've been watching you since the day that skull was found. They know about your investigation, and they're planning to stop you just like they stopped Helena. Be very careful who you trust. Detective Chen spent the next week following the leads in Marcus Finley's envelope, and what she discovered made her realize that Helena's murder had been just the beginning of a criminal enterprise that had grown beyond anything she could have imagined. The financial documents Finley had provided traced a network of shell companies and offshore accounts that stretched back to the 1940s. But these weren't just historical artifacts. Money was still flowing through these accounts, funding operations that had evolved with the times while maintaining their core criminal purpose. Chen discovered that the conspiracy had used the stolen Nazi assets from the U-219 as seed money for a financial empire. Gold and artwork looted from Europe had been gradually converted into legitimate investments over the decades. Real estate acquisitions, energy company holdings, and political campaign contributions, all funded by treasures that should have been returned to their rightful owners or donated to museums. But the modern operation was far more sophisticated than simple theft. Using Helena's research data, the conspirators had identified underwater mineral deposits and resource locations along the entire eastern seaboard. They'd spent decades quietly acquiring drilling rights, fishing territories, and coastal properties based on information that wasn't available to their competitors. It was insider trading on a massive scale, using stolen German wartime intelligence to corner natural resource markets. Judge Theodore Blackmore had emerged as the network's current leader, and his position gave him frightening power to protect the operation. As a federal judge, he could influence investigations, control the flow of evidence, and ensure that any legal challenges to the network's activities were quietly derailed. Chen discovered that Blackmore had been using his judicial authority to manipulate cases for decades. Environmental lawsuits that might have exposed the network's resource exploitation had been dismissed on technical grounds. Criminal investigations that got too close to the truth had been stalled by judicial review processes. Witnesses who might have provided damaging testimony had found themselves facing unrelated legal troubles that destroyed their credibility. The judge's influence reached far beyond the courtroom. Financial records showed he'd been channeling money from the network to politicians, law enforcement officials, and regulatory agencies. Not direct bribes, but campaign contributions, speaking fees, and consulting contracts that created a web of obligation and silence. But Chen also discovered that the conspiracy was facing internal pressures that threatened its stability. Victoria Greystone, now 89 and suffering from dementia, had become a liability. Her failing memory meant she sometimes spoke freely about things that were supposed to remain secret. Nursing home staff had reported that she occasionally talked about the submarine money and what really happened to that scientist girl. Professor Clearwater, now 94, was in even worse condition. Chen learned that he'd been making disturbing statements to his caretakers about the girl who wouldn't listen and the mistake that started everything. His family had been pushing for him to be placed in a secure facility where his ramblings couldn't be overheard by outsiders. Younger members of the network were questioning whether the continued secrecy was necessary. Some argued that the original crimes were so old that prosecution was unlikely, and that maintaining the cover-up created more risk than exposure. But older members like Blackmore understood that revealing the network's activities would lead to civil lawsuits, asset forfeiture, and criminal charges that could destroy everyone involved. The discovery of Helena's skull had created panic within the group. Chen found evidence of emergency meetings, encrypted communications, and urgent financial transfers that suggested the network was preparing for the worst-case scenario. But they'd made a crucial mistake. In their haste to move Helena's remains before the Institute's new sonar mapping project began, they'd chosen a location near Devil's Teeth that seemed safe, but was actually heavily fished by local lobstermen. The strong currents in that area, which they'd thought would scatter any evidence, had instead carried Helena's skull directly into Ezra Thornfield's trap. Chen realized that the network's very sophistication had become a weakness. Their decades of careful planning and coordination had created a paper trail that modern forensic accounting could follow. Bank records, Property transfers and communication patterns that had seemed secure in earlier decades were now vulnerable to digital analysis. The network had also grown beyond the original 4 conspirators. Chen identified at least 12 current members, including 3 sitting judges, 2 senators, a major energy company CEO, and several high-ranking law enforcement officials. But this expansion had created new vulnerabilities. Not everyone in the network had the same commitment to secrecy that the original conspirators had maintained. Some newer members were already distancing themselves from the operation. Financial records showed several recent withdrawals from network accounts, suggesting that people were trying to extract their money before everything collapsed. Chen knew she was running out of time. The network was aware that their secret was compromised, and they had the resources and connections to either flee the country or eliminate anyone who threatened them. Helena's murder proved they were willing to kill to protect their operation, and 36 years of successful cover-up had made them confident in their ability to make problems disappear. But Chen had advantages that Helena hadn't possessed: modern forensic techniques, digital analysis capabilities, and federal law enforcement partnerships that could move faster than the network's traditional methods of corruption and intimidation. The question was whether she could move fast enough to prevent them from destroying evidence and silencing witnesses before justice could be served. Marcus Finley was found dead in his Portland apartment on December 3, 2023, just 10 days after his confession to Detective Chen. The official cause of death was heart failure related to his cancer treatment, but Chen knew better. The network had silenced their insider before he could testify. Chen received the call from Portland police at 6:30 a.m. Finley's landlord had found him collapsed in his living room when he'd failed to answer his door for a scheduled maintenance visit. Paramedics had pronounced him dead at the scene, and the attending physician had attributed his death to the advanced cancer that had been ravaging his body. But when Chen arrived at the apartment, she immediately noticed details that didn't fit the natural death scenario. Finley's medication bottles were arranged too neatly on his kitchen counter. His research materials, the documents he'd promised to help Chen interpret, were missing. Most tellingly, his coffee cup was still warm despite his body being in rigor mortis. Chen insisted on an autopsy, despite resistance from officials who saw no reason to investigate the death of a terminally ill cancer patient. The medical examiner initially balked at the request, citing budget constraints and the obvious cause of death. It took pressure from Chen's superiors and threats of federal intervention to get Finley's body properly examined. The autopsy results confirmed Chen's suspicions and added a new layer of horror to the investigation. Dr. Kim discovered traces of succinylcholine in Finley's bloodstream, a powerful paralytic agent used in surgical procedures. In small doses, it was a legitimate medical drug. In larger quantities, it could cause respiratory failure that would appear to be natural heart failure, especially in someone already weakened by cancer. "This is a professional's weapon," Dr. Kim explained to Chen. Succinylcholine breaks down quickly in the body, making it difficult to detect unless you know exactly what to look for. Without the autopsy, this would have been classified as a natural death. But the killer had made one crucial mistake. In their haste to eliminate Finley, they'd overlooked a safety net he'd put in place. 3 days after his death, Chen received a call from a Portland attorney who'd been instructed to contact law enforcement if Finley died under any circumstances. "Mr. Finley left specific instructions," the lawyer explained. "He said that if anything happened to him, I was to give you access to a safety deposit box at First National Bank. He seemed to think his life might be in danger. The contents of that safety deposit box would change everything." Finley had prepared for the possibility of his murder with meticulous care. The box contained detailed written confessions, audio recordings of his meetings with network members, photographs of evidence storage locations, and financial documents that traced the flow of stolen Nazi assets through decades of legitimate-seeming transactions. But the most damaging evidence was a collection of recordings Finley had made over the years. Using hidden recording devices, he'd captured conversations with network members discussing everything from Helena's murder to ongoing resource theft operations. Judge Blackmore's voice was clearly identifiable on several recordings, discussing the need to manage potential witnesses and protect the operation at all costs. One recording in particular made Chen's blood run cold. It was a conversation between Blackmore and another network member discussing Chen's investigation. "The detective is getting too close," Blackmore's voice said. "She's asking the right questions and finding the right people. We need to consider our options for containment." The other voice, which Chen didn't recognize, responded with chilling practicality. "The same solution we used for the scientist? It worked well last time." Blackmore's reply was even more disturbing. "If necessary, but let's try other methods first. Discrediting her investigation might be less risky than making her disappear." Chen realized that Finley's warning had been more urgent than she'd understood. The network wasn't just watching her investigation. They were actively planning to stop it, using methods that had proven successful for 36 years. But Finley's posthumous revelation also provided Chen with the tools she needed to bring down the entire conspiracy. His recordings and documents contained enough evidence to secure arrests and convictions for everyone involved in the network. The key was acting fast enough to prevent the network from destroying additional evidence or eliminating other witnesses. Chen knew that Finley's death was meant to send a message. Anyone who betrayed the network would be silenced permanently. But his careful preparation had turned his murder into the network's greatest mistake. In killing him, they'd triggered the release of evidence that would expose their entire operation. The question now was whether Chen could stay alive long enough to use that evidence. Finley had died because he'd chosen to tell the truth after 36 years of silence. Chen was in danger because she'd chosen to listen. The network had killed twice to protect their secret. They wouldn't hesitate to kill again. Detective Chen knew she couldn't take down the network alone. With Marcus Finley dead and her own life clearly in danger, she needed federal backup from agents who couldn't be compromised by the conspiracy's influence. The answer came from an unexpected source. Agent Sarah Mitchell from the FBI's Public Corruption Unit had been investigating financial irregularities in several seemingly unrelated cases when Chen reached out through official channels. What Mitchell discovered during their first secure meeting was that her investigations had been circling the same network without either of them realizing it. "I've been tracking suspicious political donations and offshore accounts for 18 months, Mitchell told Chen during their clandestine meeting at a Portland safe house. The patterns kept pointing to the same shell companies and financial networks, but I couldn't figure out what connected them all." Chen's evidence provided the missing pieces of Mitchell's puzzle. The network hadn't just been stealing Nazi assets and exploiting underwater resources. They'd been using their profits to corrupt the political and legal systems that were supposed to stop them. Working together, Chen and Mitchell mapped out the full scope of the conspiracy. The network currently included Judge Blackmore, 2 sitting senators, 3 federal judges, the CEO of Atlantic Energy Corporation, and at least 6 high-ranking law enforcement officials across multiple agencies. Their influence reached into state governments, federal regulatory agencies, and even international financial institutions. But the network's strength was also its weakness. The more people involved, the more evidence trails existed, and the harder it became to coordinate a unified response to threats. Mitchell's financial analysis revealed that several members were already trying to extract their assets and distance themselves from the operation. "They're scared," Mitchell observed. "Finley's death was supposed to intimidate potential witnesses, but it's actually caused panic. Some of these people are ready to flip if we can offer them protection and reduced sentences." Chen and Mitchell developed a strategy that would require perfect timing and absolute secrecy. They would coordinate simultaneous raids across 6 states, targeting all known network members before any of them could warn the others or destroy evidence. The plan had to account for the network's law enforcement connections. Several FBI agents and federal marshals were potentially compromised, meaning the operation had to be conducted by carefully vetted personnel with no prior connection to any of the suspects. Mitchell assembled a team of agents from outside the regional offices, bringing in specialists from Chicago, Atlanta, and Los Angeles, who had no history with the Maine-based investigation. Chen worked with state police units from New Hampshire and Vermont, creating a task force that couldn't be infiltrated by network informants. The raids were scheduled for November 15, 2023, exactly 1 month after Ezra Thornfield's discovery had started the investigation. The symbolic timing wasn't accidental. Chen wanted the network to understand that their decades of impunity were ending precisely 1 month after their first major mistake. But as the task force prepared to move, the network made one final, desperate play. On the morning of November 15th, just hours before the coordinated arrests were scheduled to begin, a massive explosion destroyed the Darrington Institute's main research facility. The blast was so powerful, it shattered windows 3 miles away and could be felt across 2 counties. Chen was in the FBI command center when the explosion occurred. The seismic monitoring equipment registered the blast as a magnitude 2.1 earthquake, and emergency services initially thought a commercial airliner had crashed. "They're destroying the evidence," Mitchell said grimly as they watched news footage of the burning building. 40 years of research files, financial records, communication logs. It's all going up in smoke. The explosion had been carefully planned. It occurred during a shift change when the building was nearly empty, minimizing casualties but maximizing destruction. Initial reports suggested a gas leak had caused the blast, but Chen knew better. This was the network's final act of defiance, their attempt to erase decades of evidence before facing justice. But the raids proceeded as planned. At exactly 11:30 a.m., FBI agents arrested Judge Blackmore in his federal courthouse chambers. Professor Clearwater was taken into custody at his assisted living facility. Victoria Greystone was detained at her nursing home, though her advanced dementia meant she barely understood what was happening. The 2 senators were arrested simultaneously in Washington, D.C., while the energy company's CEO was apprehended at his corporate headquarters in Boston. Lower-level network members were rounded up across New England, their carefully constructed lives of respectability crumbling in a matter of hours. But even as the arrests unfolded, Chen couldn't shake the feeling that the network had won a crucial victory. The explosion at the Darrington Institute had destroyed evidence that could have exposed additional crimes and conspirators. The full scope of their activities would never be known, and some of their secrets would remain buried forever. The network was finished but not defeated. Even in collapse, they'd managed to protect some of their darkest secrets from ever seeing the light of day. The trials that followed made national headlines and became the most sensational criminal proceedings in Maine's history. But for Detective Chen, watching justice finally served after 36 years felt both triumphant and incomplete. Judge Theodore Blackmore's trial began 6 months after his arrest, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. Finley's recordings, financial documents, and Chen's investigation had built an airtight case for conspiracy, murder, and decades of criminal enterprise. The once powerful federal judge sat in the defendant's chair, his carefully constructed facade finally stripped away. The prosecution presented evidence that stunned even experienced court observers. Blackmore had used his judicial position to protect a criminal network for over 3 decades, manipulating cases and corrupting the justice system he'd sworn to uphold. The stolen Nazi assets had funded not just personal enrichment, but a systematic corruption of American institutions. Blackmore was convicted on all counts and sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. He would serve his sentence in the same federal prison system he'd once helped oversee as a judge. Professor Clearwater's case presented different challenges. At 94 and suffering from advanced dementia, he was deemed mentally unfit to stand trial. The man who'd murdered his own student with cold calculation spent his final days in a secure medical facility, his brilliant mind destroyed by age and guilt. He died 18 months later, taking whatever remaining secrets he possessed to his grave. Victoria Greystone never lived to see trial. Her dementia had progressed rapidly after her arrest, and she died of natural causes while in custody. Chen often wondered if Greystone's failing memory had been a mercy, allowing her to forget the terrible things she'd helped cover up for so many years. The two senators and other political figures faced separate trials that exposed the network's influence throughout the federal government. Campaign finance violations, bribery charges, and conspiracy convictions destroyed careers and sent shockwaves through Washington. The energy company's CEO received a 20-year sentence and was ordered to pay billions in restitution for resources stolen using German wartime intelligence. But the most significant victory was the recovery of the U-219 itself. Using Helena's research notes and modern salvage technology, federal authorities raised the submarine from its watery grave in an operation that captured international attention. The submarine's cargo hold yielded treasures beyond imagination: Nazi gold, stolen artwork, and scientific documents that provided new insights into World War II history. More importantly, the submarine contained evidence of other crimes, documents that suggested the network's activities had been even more extensive than anyone had realized. Maps of additional resource deposits, lists of contacts in South America, and financial records that pointed to international connections the investigation had never uncovered. Captain Ezra Thornfield became an unlikely hero, his accidental discovery having solved one of Maine's most notorious cold cases. But he remained haunted by the knowledge that he'd been sailing over Helena's remains for decades, never knowing that evidence of justice lay just beneath the waters he called home. "I keep thinking about all those mornings I spent fishing right above where they'd hidden her," Ezra told Chen during one of their final conversations. "Makes you wonder what other secrets are down there, what other families are still waiting for answers." Detective Chen was promoted to the FBI's cold case unit, where she continued investigating crimes that others had given up on. She carried with her the knowledge that justice, while sometimes delayed, could still be served, but also the understanding that some secrets run so deep they may never fully surface. The case officially closed on December 20th, 2023, but questions remained that would never be answered. The explosion at the Darrington Institute had destroyed evidence that could have revealed additional crimes and conspirators. How many other networks operated in the shadows of American society? How many other Helena Vasquez stories were waiting to be discovered? Financial investigators estimated that the network had stolen resources worth over $2 billion during their decades of operation. Restitution efforts would continue for years, but much of the stolen wealth had been dispersed through legitimate investments and charitable donations, making recovery impossible. The most haunting question concerned the network's international connections. Documents recovered from the U-219 suggested similar operations in other countries, networks of criminals who'd built legitimate-seeming enterprises on foundations of theft and murder. How many other scientists, journalists, or investigators had been silenced for getting too close to these secrets? Helena Vasquez finally had justice, but her story served as a reminder that even in death, the truth has a way of rising to the surface, no matter how deep it's buried or how long it takes to emerge. Her courage in facing her killers, her refusal to be silenced or bought, had ultimately led to the exposure of a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of American society. In the dark waters of Blackwater Bay, where the U-219 had rested for nearly 80 years, the currents continued their eternal dance. But now they carried away the last traces of a conspiracy that had shaped American history from the shadows. Some mysteries are solved, but others are just beginning. And somewhere in the depths, new secrets wait for their own fishermen to pull them into the light.